Hello, and welcome to the online message of Corinth Christian Church. 1 Samuel 13:14 says, "Now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." Maybe some of you have made models when you were younger. Maybe as a boy you received a model car or a model airplane or a battleship maybe, and you put that model together. I can remember I put together the model of an engine. It was made out of clear plastic. You may have seen them. You could hook a battery up to it and you could see how the different parts of the engine would work. You know, one of the things about those models is we look at them and we often say, I want something like this. I want a motor like this that can create a lot of horsepower. I want a car that looks like this. We often try to model ourselves after other people. We look around and we say, I want to be like this sports figure or this actress or this actor. And we may dress like them. We may wear their shoes. We may wear clothing line that they put out. But we want to be like them. We're trying to model ourselves after them. In the Old Testament, there's a person that's described whose very heart was modeled after the heart of God. And you know who that person is. It's David. David was described as a man after God's own heart. His heart was like God's heart. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? David's story began before he was even born. The people of Israel had moved into the promised land and there had been relatively peaceful times, and they decided they needed an earthly king like those people around them, like the people they just driven out of the promised land. Now God knew that it wasn't in their best interest to have an earthly king, a human being as king. But free will is kind of a funny thing, and when the Israelites decide that's what they want, God allows them to have that. He uses Samuel to carry out this transition and to make Saul the new king. Samuel is the guy that God uses in a multifunctioning roles. He was the last of the judges. He was also a prophet, and he was also the high priest. And so God chooses Saul to be king, and Samuel anoints him, and he seems like a really good person to choose to be king. He's head and shoulders taller than anyone else in Israel. Said he was a striking man. And at first things go pretty well. Saul's a godly king. He's committed to the Lord and his will for the people. But at some point things kind of fall off the tracks. On one occasion, just before battle, King Saul became impatient and nervous. He was waiting for Samuel to come to offer sacrifices to determine God's will about whether he should go into battle or not. And finally, Saul got impatient and he offered the sacrifices himself. The problem was that he offered sacrifices that, according to the law, only a priest could offer. He wasn't a priest. He did it in front of all the people of Israel, so everyone knew about it. And basically, he set into motion what would take place for the Israelites, a series of events that would take place that would determine how their nation would end up. God told him, because of what he did in making these sacrifices, that his rule was over. He said, your kingdom will not endure. He goes, with your death, a man of my choosing who has a heart like mine will take over. And he describes how Saul's sons will be servants to someone else. They're not going to receive the opportunity to be king as would normally take place in a monarchy, that it would be passed down to the sons or daughters, and it's not going to happen for them. They're actually going to serve a different king. Now, a long time passed before that prophecy takes place, before that prophecy of God takes place. And in the meantime, Saul goes against God again. God tells him to go against the Amalekites, and he says, you're to destroy everything about the Amalekites. You're to destroy all the people, all their livestock, everything they own is to be destroyed. But Saul secretly disobeyed. At least he thought it was a secret. He didn't kill everyone. In fact, he spared cattle for himself. And he also spared the king, most likely as a trophy, that he could bring the king back and say, look at this guy. I'm the one that defeated him. 1 Samuel 15:28 says, Samuel said to Saul, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. Still a long time passed before God passed that kingdom on, because he was waiting for the right time, the right person at the right time. And right then, this person was still a boy. But finally the day came and God chose David. He chose David to be king. He sent Samuel to Jesse's house. Jesse was David's father. And he sent him there to pick one of Jesse's sons to be king. He went through the first 7 boys, and each one he thought this could be the one. In fact, the first one he's like, this surely has to be him. He's the kind of person that looks like a king. But every one of them, God says no. And then Samuel looks at Jesse and says, do you have any more children? He says, well, the youngest, he's out tending sheep. He was so unimportant, Jesse didn't even bring him in. He couldn't think of any way on earth that God would choose his youngest son to be king. He just wasn't king material. But Samuel tells him, go and get him. And they go and they get David and they bring him back. And God tells Samuel, this is the one. And Samuel anoints him with oil to be the next king. Now you can picture maybe Samuel and even David both were a little nervous at this point, because they knew what had taken place. He had been anointed to be king, and Saul was still on the throne. At some point, he knew that if Saul found out about this, he would do everything he could to try to stop it, even including putting him to death. And so David's family gathers around. He's anointed king. And God tells him, as he's anointed, he tells Samuel, he says, don't be fooled. He goes, you've looked at the outward appearance, but I look at what's on the inside. He says, he may not look that impressive outwardly. He goes, but I choose him because of his heart. I look at the inward appearance of a person. And none of the other sons, 7 of them, they were all passed by. None of them had the heart that God saw that David had. And so David is chosen out of this group, and God makes it clear that he is the one. Samuel anoints him, and immediately God's Spirit begins to work to lead to the steps that would lead David to be king. One of the first things that he does is he removes his spirit from Saul. And Saul is now tormented by a spirit that will not leave him alone. He's mentally tormented. He needs something to soothe his nerves. And so he goes and he finds a musician to come and play for him. And that musician just happens to be David, son of Jesse, the person that's just been anointed king. Here's David that comes to play music for Saul. He's going to take Saul's place. See, David, the man after God's own heart, starts this long road to ruling as king, and he basically goes wherever God leads him. Now, the first lesson we need to learn from the story of David is that God's still looking for people with a heart like his. See, our world is a lot like the world of the Israelites back when David was living. We take and look around and get much of our purpose, much of our direction from those around us. Our movies and magazines break the hearts of people every day because they portray something that's just not true. And we look at that and we want it to be true. We try to emulate it. We try to model ourselves after some of those people, and it just doesn't work. There's actually websites where teens and young adults can post pictures of themselves and ask people to rate how attractive they are. We choose our leaders according to how they look. In 2008, when Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin were running against each other, there was probably more talk about their hair and her glasses than there was about the issues many times. We all get caught up in looking at outward things, but God's different. He doesn't get caught up in the outward appearances. He looks at the heart, and that's where the Pharisees were so messed up. They weren't just looking at the outward appearances, but they were looking at the appearance of outward deeds. They thought if your deeds were right, well, then God would be pleased, even if your heart was all messed up, even if it was filled with evil thoughts and motives. Jesus came and said, that's not right. He says, you need to be like David. God looked at his heart, and you need to allow God to look at your heart. Problem is, for many people, their hearts aren't so right. Matthew 23:27 says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead men's bones and everything unclean. See, we often think that God is pleased with us because of the outward deeds that we're doing. They look good, they seem good, people take notice of them, but God wants us to take a moment and examine our heart. He wants us to look and see if maybe we need to cleanse our heart. It's easy to get caught up in doing good deeds. It's easy to get caught up in making ourselves look good on the outside. But sometimes, even for Christians, it's hard to know the difference between outward deeds and the heart. The difference between what God wants us to be and what we really are. It's often a lot easier to clean up the outside than it is to clean up the inside. It's a lot easier to go to church than to really worship sometimes. It's a lot easier to bow your head with just a pious look on your face rather than really examine yourself when communion is being served. It's a lot easier to put a decal on your car that says something about your church or maybe the ichthus symbol. It's a lot easier to do that than it is to forgive those who have wronged you, show mercy to those in need, to love the unneedy. See, that only happens when our heart's changed. What does it look like to change our heart? What does it look like maybe to have what we might call today a heart transplant? David had a heart like God's because what was most important to God was important to David. Later, Paul will talk about David and says the reason God chose him is because he was willing to do whatever God told him to do. See, Saul wasn't. He was too busy trying to raise his own standing. But you know what David did after he was anointed king? He went back to taking care of sheep. He probably thought, you know what, there's a lot of sheep I got back in Bethlehem. That's no place for a king, but again, I've got to get going because I got sheep to take care of. He was willing to wait for God's timing. He was willing to wait for the leading that God would give him. You know, we mentioned this earlier, God's heart. God's heart is holy. It's perfect, without sin. Ours isn't like that. but our heart can be. See, we try to imagine God's heart like us, like ours, but really our heart is supposed to be like His. We think our heart's a pretty good heart. We really don't see any wrong that we've done that would deserve for us to go to hell. We've been pretty good. We believe, based on the evidence, that there's really more for us than against us. And we often ignore what God really said. We often believe that our sin is not really that big a deal. And the reason is because we want it that way. We want to be people that on the outside look really good. But God says that we need to look on the inside. Make sure our heart's different. Make sure our heart is modeled after His. David was a man after God's own heart. And for each one of us, we can have the opportunity, if we're really willing to be faithful, if we're really willing to turn away from sin and to have it removed from our life, we can have the hope that someday God will look at us and all of that is His will be gathered together. We'll all be gathered there around the throne. And we can only hope that someday God will look down at each one of us and say, a person after my heart. The good news is Jesus came to offer us forgiveness and allow us to make a change and allow His Spirit to live in us, which gives us the opportunity to be like Jesus. That we can emulate Him and that we can follow Him and that we can be the one that people can point to and say, he's just like Jesus. God's heart is calling us today, calling us to give our lives to Him and to follow Him. Maybe today you haven't been baptized. Maybe today's the day that you need to make things right with God. If that's the case, I hope that you'll give me a call at the end of this message. So important because we want to recognize the decision that you've made. We look forward to hearing from you soon. Till next time, God bless you. Take care. I love you.